Okay, so we left off in the Magnificat with the black highlighted text explaining that in Mary's chronology that represents Christ at age 54, having already died at the beginning of the 201st anniversary of the temple. Bear in mind that what makes the Bible chronology difficult is that they switch between beginning and end of year because they're being very precise. And so sometimes you're going to get a +1 or even +2 or -1 or -2 versus what you expect. And then when you do the tally, like here, if you were to do the tally from 164, you easily get a 54 left over when you subtract out the 14, because that's what she does. But when you go through it line by line like we've done, you'll see that this is 15 or 16. And that's because she's adjusting between the fact that her son was scheduled to die at the beginning of a year versus this tally going through to the end of the year. All right, it's you have to keep going back and forth with it. Anyway, where we had left off was to show that this is a 54. And that's going to be important because we're going to get into Daniel. Because she's tying to Daniel when she does that. Paul's going to pick up on what she does here, highlighted in black, to form Ephesians 1:3 through 14. I'm still in a state of shock over that. And it's very sophisticated kind of number play that she's doing. But before I can even get into that, sorry that this is so convoluted, before I can even get into that, I have to go back and explain something I didn't understand about this section of text here. All right? What I had said in the last increment was that that section of text corresponded to the period between roughly 120 BC to 100 BC. And I didn't understand why she was benchmarking it, and I especially didn't understand why that text. Okay, I mean, we have been so ingrained in Western society to regard this text with a certain meaning that to think that it has some other meaning that is rather more sophisticated is kind of hard to swallow, okay? But hopefully if you've been watching the meter videos and you are a masochist like I am, you realize that, hello, when God does a thing, He does it on multiple layers so that you can be walking to Ephesus, because they were a low technology society. You can be walking to Ephesus or threshing wheat. You have these verses memorized and you can mull them over to learn more about God and ennoble the time that you're spending. Because nobody likes to spend his time in a low function. Okay? That was the design of Scripture. And that's the idea of it. It's supposed to be running in your head so you can be doing the dishes or going and getting your dry cleaning or standing in line at the bus. And you can mull this over and enjoy it and make better use of the time. So one of the things they did was they would have multiple entendre sentences. And in Greek in particular and in Hebrew, if you use ellipsis, which is very frequent, or you block text the way she's done it here, that ends up having a different meaning that's related to what she's saying, but isn't the same as what she's saying. Okay? And it took me a while. I had to think about it. What else could this text mean? Apart from our, typical, Bible movie version of it, which just robs us of all other ideas and meanings. Okay, think about this. In Greek, Hebrew, even in English, we have titles that start out with a genitive. That's a genitive case there. And our genitive case uses the preposition of. Like if you were saying, concerning female slaves, concerning the female slave. Because this word, this ending here, means female. Can't divorce it from the text. That's why I've got it in parentheses here. You're supposed to read that as part of the verse. Of his female slave, 5 syllables. Okay? You have to think a little bit. You can't just look at this and say, well, what is that? If this were all capitalized like that, see, now it has a different meaning to you when you see that. Oh, it's about. We think of the word about when we see that. About his female slave. All right? They didn't use caps in, that would even be clearer in English. See? Of his female slave. We know immediately that was a title. Okay? But in Greek, this is how it actually reads. And there's no period in the Greek. I just put it there. We know from the prior context that that's a sentence. But in Greek, you had this double entendre. Same thing with Hebrew, same thing actually in English. If I took that period out and I made it into a title, let's just do that, okay? And in ancient English, you would have periods if you wanted to designate the text separately as a title. So we'll leave it. Of his female slave. That's the title of this section. Now, who's the female slave now? If all you're looking at is this, what is the main depiction of Israel in the Old Testament? Remember, the New Testament hadn't been written when Mary's talking. So she knows the Old. She's thinking of the Old. And as you'll see in later videos, she's frequently quoting the Old in her Magnificat. This woman was not stupid about Scripture. The main depiction of Israel, which after all, this is the timeline she's talking about, freedom of Israel from Greece. Yeah, okay, freedom of Israel from Greece. Yeah, okay, Israel's under Hyrcanus, who is apostate as he can be. He's kind of like Jeroboam, going wild. All right, this is all about Israel getting freedom, despite the fact that she's being led by a guy who himself is apostate. God uses unbelievers, so why can't he use an apostate believer? All right, Israel's freedom, 129 BC. Israel's freedom, these are benchmarks that really were significant to her history, 122 BC. This is coming 5 years later at about 116 BC. There were things that happened that helped her freedom. And then we go here, and then we come finally down here, and at syllable 63, which she's showing as vote short, and she should show it as vote short, because Israel's apostate. Israel is apostate. She is allowing herself to be governed by an apostate Jew who plays off the newly formed Pharisees and Sadducees against each other, sort of siding with the Sadducees, who didn't even believe in resurrection. All right? So they're apostate. They're completely apostate. The whole Pharisaical thing is apostasy. We Christians have our own version of that, so don't blame the Jews. Okay? They were totally apostate. So 63 characterizes them. And this is the section of history she's talking about, down to, and that's 63. Let me just leave it open. Okay, down to, and we'll just leave that 63 gold there. That is the period of 100 BC. Hyrcanus dies during this period. And this is really interesting because Makariosin. You have to put your voice upward. It's not really an accent. It's not really a stress accent. It's a pitch accent. Happy. Yeah, she's going to be happy when Hyrcanus dies. 104 BC in our parlance. He dies right at the end of that word. And why is she happy? Why are all generations... It's translated blessed, but this really means happy. Blessed, I only had one syllable, so I had to translate it the typical blessed. That's not what it means. It means happy. Okay? Why is she saying that? Because Hyrcanus is gone. And other things happened during this period which I'm going to cover in the next increment because my mouse battery is dying. So what is she covering around 100 BC? Well, what she's covering is the changeover that was occurring. She must have been extraordinarily informed. The changeover that was occurring during this period was basically Hyrcanus going nuts, with going power mad, and at the same time the nations around him, again chiefly Greece, which is the king of the north, the Ptolemies, which is the king of the south, and they're both Greek peoples, descendants of the generals and related people under Alexander the Great. And then, of course, our newly arising Rome. Rome, at this time, that's highlighted in black, was finally coming into its own militarily. Basically what had happened was Rome was pushed into getting involved because of the I covered that in the last episode. Rome was pushed into getting involved because the Persians pushed the Greeks. The Greeks were already colonizing the Mediterranean in the south, the underbelly of Rome. Rome started to feel that pressure. And meanwhile, Rome was also coalescing itself with its different tribes. And unlike the way the Greeks would handle their conquering, when the Romans conquered the Samnites and blah, 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 when they did that, they did a deal at the end. Hi, you'll get to be citizens of Rome. Now, that ended up having an extraordinary amount of appeal to people. First of all, because they were all Latins of one kind or another. They shared a common history of a certain amount. And they were all alike against the Greeks, who were pushing at the coastlands of what we call Italy today. All right, the Greeks were trying to get footholds, and they wanted trading posts, but where trade goes, politics follow, and then the military follows in order to protect the economics. So the Romans started to feel the crush of what was essentially Greek peoples who were calling themselves Carthaginians. All right, again, like I said before, they were related to Tyre and Sidon, and Tyre and Sidon had a long history of getting along with Israel ever since Solomon. It was Hiram of Tyre who helped Solomon build the temple. So they had a long history going back. It didn't matter, because Israel's always been sort of cosmopolitan in her dealings with others. It didn't matter that the Greeks were, worshiping pagans and all that. They were pagans and worshiping really gross gods and all that stuff. They still maintained friendly relations. So Rome ended up getting into the whole conflict with Israel because of the incursions made by the Greeks at her underside. Rome was trying to prevent the Greeks from making incursions on Italy, and that was one of the, this population incursion, trade, military following, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of what encouraged the Romans to fight with their fellow Latin tribes and try to get suzerainty over them so that nobody could make treaties with those people and thus hurt Rome. Rome has always been very paranoid about its defense. That's really what started Rome to become Rome. That's really the mindset of where it starts out. It's very, very like the Soviet Union. Okay, very different economic policy. Rome really believed in free enterprise to a huge extent, unlike the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, Russia in particular, has always had, in spite of its bigness, has always had a concern about its borderlands being buffer states. That's what they always wanted. So Rome had a similar, similar mindset, and that's how it grew. So this black text that's highlighted is really showing the rise of Rome, and there were particular things that happened during this period. Like, for example, right here, 47, that's about 117 BC. Rome had finished coalescing with the Samnite Wars. Then they got into it with the Carthaginians, and that was the name of the Punic Wars. Okay, and there were 3 of those, and they lasted almost, a century or so. And so they were just coming out of that. They were just starting to recover. The Republic was really getting soft. And at the same time, there were certain leaders who rose among them. Okay, this would be the rise of the Claudio Julians, all right, at this point. And there was a guy who ended up being the uncle of Julius Caesar, was just starting to get his feet wet at this point. And in fact, at this point, well, really between this point and this point, during this period, right in here, Ilugar Apotunun, all right, from now on, that's really cute. From now on, from this point onward, this guy, I think his name was Marcius, he married into the Claudio Julian family and ended up becoming the uncle of Julius Caesar. And he was really kind of brilliant at organizing. All right, his fortunes went up and down, and he ended up, being very sorry for it by the time we get down here. But he was an actor on the stage. He had his role of helping Israel by means of helping Rome, because what this guy did, he was consul a couple of times, 7 or 8 times. What he ended up doing was he revolutionized Roman military. See, they had been fighting so many wars that they were losing manpower, because they used to have this old rule that you had to be noble in order to fight. What this guy did is he opened up the eligibility for being in the army to anybody. Well, and then, and you got these great rewards at the end. My pastor spent a lot of time when he was exegeting different parts of Ephesians on this, to explain to us, our rewards in heaven are likened to the rewards that you got for being a Roman soldier. You got citizenship, you got land, you got all kinds of things. And that would induce people to want to go and fight for the 25 years that they were in the military. You didn't go for like a 2-year stint. You went in and you had to stay. And that stabilized the military. He opened it up to the common man, so that kept the nobles, the ranks of the nobles, from being decimated. And it helped everybody feel like they had a share in it. It helped unify the whole idea of being Roman. It ennobled and unified Rome like nothing else could have done. And he also, this is really interesting, he also invented a new system of fighting, not entirely an invention of his own, but he made it work, called the maniple. The maniple is like, okay, how do I want to put this? In the old days, what they did is all the troops got together in a little box of people. Okay, and you were in like a 4-corner box, and then you just moved the box forward on the flat field, and then you just basically drove through your opposing enemy as long as you held your box together. That was called a phalanx. And there were times when, if you want to be creative, you could take part of that box and sort of open up one side or open the other side, and then get the enemy inside it and then close the box. And that way you'd kill your enemy. Okay, they were considered unassailable for a long time, that method of box fighting. Okay? But when the Romans invented the maniple, they basically had 2 boxes. Okay, but then the middle was a problem. And what this guy did is he invented a way to have a good middle, and so that you could have you have 2 or 3 boxes essentially closing around the one box that the Greeks had developed. It was really, really, really phenomenal how they did it. They made certain other changes too. But the point is that this one guy, this black text is highlighting his lifetime, or his success time. He goes into disrepute right here, about 100 BC. He gets in trouble with Rome. They didn't like him. He was too successful, or whatever it was. Okay, so that's highlighting the change that occurred that revolutionized Roman history. Rome made its reputation and even started to become Rome by means of military movement. They didn't even have a navy at the beginning, but because of the Punic Wars, they developed one. All right? They didn't really have much of an army either, but because of the Punic Wars, they developed one. And because of the incursions by the Greeks, and then, they suddenly found themselves with all these inventions that they came up with, they ended up developing a really good navy. They ended up becoming masters of the Mediterranean by this point. All right, they had already started back about, back up here, all right in this area. They had started having a lot of power, but they really came into their own right in here. All right, so now we're going to link it up with the text. Of his female slave, Israel. Mary's thinking on a higher plane. She's talking about herself, but she's linking it to the Old Testament when she talks. It's just phenomenal stuff. For God sees the humiliation. That is one, for God sees, this whole thing is one paragraph ending right here. 129 BC. For God sees. Okay, and by doing it that way, the priestly courses had generic names like that. God sees, God strengthens, God prevails. All the priestly courses had names like that. So this is very evocative and Hebraistic to just terminate the syntax right here. All right? And then you carry it one more, because this takes you down to 122 BC. For he regarded the humiliation. And in Greek, when you have a definite article, it can also function as a possessive. So now you could say it, for he regarded our humiliation, meaning the humiliation of the nation. And to say he regarded it means that Israel got some freedom, which she did, starting in 129 BC. One of the Seleucus Antiochus guys, I forget, I think it was Antiochus VII, was killed, and that freed up Israel a lot more. Of course, that's under Hyrcanus that all this happened, so he took advantage of it. But then in 122 BC, there was also more freedom, from her enemies. This had to do with the Ptolemies and a bunch of other things that were going on, to keep them somewhat at bay. All right, so he regarded our humiliation. You could end the sentence there. Greek is a lot more, you can even do that in English. Look at it. My soul magnifies the Lord. In fact, my own soul rejoices. This could be anybody in Israel recognizing the victory. In fact, my own soul rejoices upon my God, my own Savior. Yeah, he's just saved them from defeat. For he regarded our humiliation. That works. Okay, and then the next paragraph, which is what was throwing me in the last episode, if we make this a title, of his female slave, about Israel, the bride, she was supposed to be the bride of Christ. That's the only thing church inherits. It was the only conditional covenant was the Mosaic law. Israel broke it, because you break the Mosaic law if you reject Messiah. All right? And they were completely apostate during this time. Priesthood was utterly apostate. It was under Hyrcanus. He himself usurped the role of high priest. He usurped the role of being king. There was total apostasy in Israel at this point. Only the remnant, there was always a remnant who were faithfully obeying. Okay, but Israel herself, God's slave, she was in trouble. That's why that 63 is there. But God delivers her anyway. How many times do we know that story? So, of his female slave, about Israel. Idu. Arapotunun. So look at this, from now on. Okay, that's the next 7 years. Okay, so it's starting here, 47, which is equivalent to, at the end of the verse, 116, 117 BC. The verse is starting about 120 BC. Okay, that was when our boy in Rome was beginning to, get influence. In Rome, far away, in Rome. Okay, and they still had a certain amount of autonomy in Israel. So, Idu garapotunun. Look at this, from now on. All right, and that verse ends at 109 BC. Now, in 109 BC, that was when our Roman guy finally gets into power. He actually becomes consul, I want to say 3 years later. But, to become a consul, you have to go through other offices first. They had this very strict system of how you got to be at the top of the tree. You had to go through certain offices before you get there. He was getting there. All right, that's Rome. In the north, we have two very weak Seleucid kings who they're kind of like Arcadius and Honorius, in the later Roman Empire. They're very just concerned with having a good time. All right, so the king of the north is kind of like not so much of a problem now. Hyrcanus or no Hyrcanus, but Hyrcanus himself digs his own grave at this point. Hyrcanus goes and invests, meaning he besieges, a colony that had belonged to Alexander the Great, that was in the land of what we call Samaria. And those people, they were Greeks. They weren't Sumerians. The Samaritans were moved out by Alexander the Great. I forget where he moved them to. And then Hyrcanus besieged that area, and in so doing, he brought down the supposed, the people there that were besieged. They called to these two weak kings up in the north, two weak Greek kings of the Seleucids. Come help us, oh please, come help us, please, 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 please. Well, the kings do a really bad job of helping. So John Hyrcanus wins. This is 110, 109 BC. That's the period in black at the end of the verse. As a result of that, that just sort of like killed everybody's intention from the north of trying to hurt Israel. This is when Hyrcanus got, total power over Israel, finally. Okay, but he no sooner does that than he dies. 4 years later, 5 years later, 4 years later. I mean, when I say 109 BC, okay, that's at the end of 109 BC. Okay, so 4 years later, the guy's dead. And whenever a leader dies, especially in those days, there's a scamper for power, and there's a sort of breathing space. At this very time, right during this period, 107 BC forward, our boy in Rome has revolutionized the Roman army. So look at this. From now on, all generations will count me, Israel, blessed. Yeah, because you know what? Hyrcanus is dead. So now they can start practicing the law better again, or at least they have the opportunity. And by the way, Rome is getting, kitted out to come in and take over Egypt, which she's going to do within the next 40 years. So Israel gets like 40 years from 63. She's measuring it at 35. Okay, Israel gets this much time to get its act together, which of course they somewhat do. All right, so that the relatives of Hyrcanus get wiped out, the Romans step in instead, and the Romans have a hands-off policy about religious observance. So now you've got more freedom to be a Jew, which, like Mary is, meant that you learn scripture, makariosing, happiness. Yeah, I'm being blessed because now I've got more freedom to learn scripture. I have to worry about this Hyrcanus guy imposing the wrong days and the wrong months. And yeah, okay, there's still somebody in power as high priest who's, corrupt. But he doesn't have as much power as the guy before, Hyrcanus. Because you got Hyrcanus too following. But the whole line just gets real corrupt after that. Right? Fourth generation curse, okay? So, yeah, you're going to call yourself, see, look, this whole section of his female slave Israel. So look at this. From now on, yeah, measured from what? Measured from about 116 BC, when our boy John Hyrcanus really comes into his own. Idugar, Apotunun, from now on, yeah, he no sooner gets going, he no sooner gets, running around, he finally defeats his last bastion of the Greeks, then he dies. The apostate dies. He came on the stage, he flapped his lines on the stage, and now he's gone. No longer, so now I'm happy. from now on, from the time he dies onward. Everybody's going to call me blessed. Yeah, because now we're more free to be, practice what we learned in the law. Meanwhile, we got another guy who doesn't believe in Christ either, who's busy making a name for himself. That's what he thinks he's doing. Meanwhile, he's helping Rome out very, very significantly, opening up the army to everybody, which revolutionized the way Rome would work. It had massive impact on the culture of Rome to do that. All right? So yeah, everybody's going to call her blessed because Rome's going to essentially become the protector of Israel at this point. It's just 40 years away from this point. But first Rome had to get prepared, you see. God prepares your protectors, and you think you're not getting protected. You think it won't ever, change. Yeah, but from now on, honey, he's been doing it, and you're just about to see it. So all generations will count me blessed. And isn't that what we're doing? Israel is the cause of everything we got. It's a pity that the Jews themselves are so apostate that they reject Messiah. Not all Jews. There's always been a significant number of Jews who believe in Messiah as Jesus Christ. They know that. They have a problem with the fact that he's Jesus Christ and there are these people called Christians. They don't recognize that the changeover. But they still believe they're still saved. There have always been a significant number of Jews who do that. The mainstream of Judaism, like the mainstream of Christianity, is the worst of it. The most apostate is always popular. Okay, but his female slave, now church, is being protected. And look at this, from now on all generations call us blessed. Why? Because this woman who represents Israel was also being protected. She's part of the female slave Israel. And if they didn't reject Christ, we wouldn't be here. So all generations call her blessed. All generations call us blessed, because all generations should be calling Israel blessed. You get the tie? I'm really shocked myself. This is really sophisticated, isn't it? And how many times have we heard this in Bible movies, and we've only thought of Mary being pleased to be pregnant, which she couldn't have been pleased to be pregnant, because God just signed her death sentence when he told her that. Hi, for the rest of your life, you're going to be under a cloud as an adulterous woman. Hi, for the rest of your life, your son is going to be under the cloud as an illegitimate man. And in those days, that kind of stuff really mattered. That's not good news. Oh, but she's calling it good news. Why? Because she's looking past her personal. Of his female slave. This represents Israel. This was what was going on in history at the very moment she talks. Or the very moment she's talking about. And she's thinking long term. Long term past, long term future. Isn't that awesome? Okay, so in the next increment we'll go on from there. Okay, this is where we had left off. The year is 100 BC, 199 BC, 100 or 99 BC. And this is the point where the guy who is Julius Caesar's uncle kind of falls out of grace. But he was on stage long enough to do his job. Which brings up something I should have said before. I said it when I began the Synoptics video. But, the Synoptic series, but I sort of need to do this here. Time poems have, like I said, about 30 characteristics that you have to test to be sure that you're auditing it correctly, and therefore this whole business about diagnosing a time poem is self-auditing. If you make a mistake, it sticks out. All the characteristics have to be present in order to qualify as a time poem. Otherwise, it's maybe a mistake or somebody trying to make a section of text into a time poem. All right? It's very complicated. Someday I'm going to have to summarize what these characteristics are, but I've just been working with them so long, 4 years now, that I just know what to do. All right? one of the characteristics of a time poem is that it's an anthem. You know, like the national anthem, oh, say, can you see? You know? An anthem has its origin, centuries ago. It was designed to be one group of people singing to another group of people, each of them complimenting each other, and not compliment like say something nice, compliment like in fit, each fitting the other, so that you wouldn't just have one group of people singing the same thing all the time. It was deemed more interesting, and there were things you could do with it. The other word that's similar to anthem is antiphonal. Anti means instead, phone means voice. All right? So you have one voice, and then instead another voice, and then instead another voice, and then instead the first voice. Okay, singing back to each other. You see that a lot in our musicals today, like Bye Bye Birdie, or Oklahoma, when you have the big chorus scenes, or, Music Man. You have one group singing to another group. That's what this is. Okay, Psalm 90 functions like that. Isaiah 53 functions like that. Daniel functions like that, except you can't see that function in Daniel except through the meter. All right, because what he's doing is he's reporting a testimony by each king's time. So it's like he introduces little actors, and then on their behalf he says their lines. All right, it's like a little play, a musical play, not necessarily musical, but a play. All right. So when she's saying, my soul magnifies the Lord, it seems like, and on the surface, it's a soliloquy. All right. But it's divided into little sections. All right. We just saw this as one section. Okay. Now we have a replying chorus, basically, replying based on what happened before. All right. That's our chorus. So we have our first chorus group or first singer right here, ending there. And you could even call it two. You could have one singer here, or one speaker, one actor here. All right. Second actor here. Basically reaffirming. Third actor here, ending here. See, these 7 paragraphs tell you where the paragraph ends. And she's ending it in the middle of a sentence, which drove me nuts at first. But that's what pregnancy is. It's something that's not yet born, and yet in development. Okay, so there's your first trimester. It's really clever the way she's doing this. I'm not that smart. She said this right on the fly to Elizabeth. First trimester, second trimester, third trimester, or maybe you just say third. I mean, we call them trimesters today. Maybe they call them fourths. And you could treat each one of those units as a sort of standalone. You've got this one. Then you could say, well, this one is a whole standalone. But this could just be a chorus reply. Depends on how you want to, dramatically depict it. And then you have this section. All right. And now we come to the next one. This is a whole section here with, again, see, she's got 35 and then 42. She's doing the same thing here. From this to this is 35 syllables. Stopping at 98, 63 to 98. You see them both in orange on the right-hand side of the screen? That's 35 syllables. So she's doing another thing a time poem is supposed to do, palindromes. Okay? Because in the middle, this is 21 right here. That's 21 syllables in the middle. Okay? This ends at 42 before that middle. Okay, and this ends at 42. From here to here is 42 syllables. Palindrome. You got 42, 21, 42. Isn't that cute? And then sandwiched in between, of course, this to this is 35. And you got 35 on this side. But now you got 28. Because if you take this 42 and link it up here, that's 28 syllables. So it would be the humiliation of his female slave would become the title. Look at this. All generations will call me blessed. Those are the lines of an actor, female probably actor, speaking for Israel. The humiliation of his female slave. Now look at this. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. Why? Because you're humiliated? Oh yeah. What is the cross? You love somebody so much you want to be humiliated. Your joy will turn to sorrow. Your sorrow will turn to joy. What's the Sermon on the Mount? You're humiliated now, but you're going to be called blessed. Blessed are you when what? When you are oppressed. It's easy to understand how the Sermon on the Mount came to be. This was the mother teaching the humanity of Christ. This is how she thought. Isn't that cool? So you got your palindrome. 35 here, 35 here, 28 here in the middle, or you could call it 42, 21 in the middle, okay, followed by 42. Isn't that cute? Just to make sure you get the pun, her son was to be 98 when the millennium began. That was in the chronology ever since David died, and it was memorialized by Isaiah. Okay, in his meter of Isaiah 53. That would have been the 1098th anniversary of David's united kingship. 7 years later, right here, the 105. That would have been the 1104th anniversary of David's Hebron kingship. Okay? Which is 7 years later. So in other words, they're being tied together. The anniversaries are being tied together. For what? This literally means from generation to generation, but it's only 8 syllables, so I had to translate it as from and to. From generation to generation forever, he will be on the throne. As of the 1098th anniversary of David's David's united kingship start, which was when he had to be born, and then die, of course, and measured as the 1104th anniversary of David's Hebron kingship start, which Daniel used. Because remember, we're getting into Mary's ties to Daniel. Okay, so what period in history does this represent? So we go back. And remember, she's measuring from original Hanukkah. And the 98 there, as we covered in the previous episode, this references the time of Pompey. Why? Because she had already built Rome the Rescuer through that guy Marcius, who was the uncle of the guy named Julius, we call Julius Caesar. Okay, he revolutionized the Roman military at the time, yeah. And because the Roman military was revolutionized, this could happen with Pompey coming in 65 BC. 65, 64, 63. Again, it's a campaign. You don't just march all your troops around the Mediterranean and into Egypt and up and down the Levant in, a few minutes. Took a couple of years. So we call it 63 BC, but that's really where he entered the temple. He had already been on a campaign for a couple of years at that point. Okay, and that was part of the triumvirate with Julius Caesar. I think it was part of I get so confused with these guys. I think it was Pompey, Lepidus, and Mark Antony. No, that was later. Sorry, I get confused with the names. But you got the reference point. It's 65 through 63 BC. All right. And then here is 7 years later, and that ends up being 58 BC. And we'll pick up with that in the next increment, because I've got to stop and explain what that is. Okay, now we're getting into 59 BC and its significance. In order to introduce that, I thought I might as well just go on the internet, search on the year, and see if I could find a decent, looking outline for you. And I found it in this book. A guy named H.H. Scullard. He wrote this book about 50 years ago. This guy Marius that I was talking about, see in the middle here, where it's highlighted with BC, where I'm, moving the page. That guy Marius is the one that I'm kind of talking about. He was the guy who helped revolutionize the Roman army. And, like every character in Roman history, whether it's early Rome or late Rome, no matter how many good deeds he did, he always has some kind of shameful thing, or he gets really in trouble with the people or something at the end. Not that it's his fault, it's just to show you that the more good deeds you do, the more people hate you. Okay, that's my philosophy of life too. Is just don't even, if you want to pursue something good in life that's going to be remunerative for whatever your reasons are, fine. But don't expect that people are going to like you for it. You're going to be disappointed. All right, there are reasons to pursue fame, there are reasons to pursue wealth, and you should do that. It's necessary and good thing for your own soul's training. Okay? Because Christ is wealthy, you better learn how to be. All right? And you'll always be wealthy in doctrine, so you don't have to worry if you get the physical kind. But honey, if you get the physical kind, if you get fame and physical wealth, people will hate you for it. There's nothing good that comes out of it, except whatever training you got in your soul and whatever pleasures you might have had the meanwhile. That's it. This world has nothing to offer as far as any lasting, memory, or people will remember me, I'll be important. That's a lot of baloney. Okay? People just hate you. All right? So now we come here. This guy falls out of grace. That's number 8 here, where I'm moving the page. Marius' sixth consulship. He was the guy who helped revolutionize the Roman military. Then we have, and this was the thing I was forgetting about, is that Pompey, remember Pompey from 63 BC? And that was at Mary's syllable number 98. That's the guy, Pompey. He gets into, that's his consulship in 70 BC. And as a result of it, he ends up leading the armies that culminate in taking over and him being, fat-headed and wanting to enter the Temple of Jerusalem by 63 BC. Okay, but Rome still ended up being the savior of Israel, away from the two competing Greek states, which were the Seleucids, king of the north in Daniel, and the Ptolemies, king of the south in Daniel. All right? So then you have this little history about the other wars that Rome was going through in Pompey. And right here on page 88 is where it's tying to syllable 98 in Mary. Okay? Now here's where it gets into a deal. There you got the Catiline conspiracy. That's a whole thing. Very excellent speech by Cicero. If it's not, Cicero's kind of wordy, full of himself. But anyway, this was Crassus, and then Crassus and Pompey had sort of gotten together as consuls, and they were both competitors as well as allies. Okay, this is total typical Roman politics. And Caesar was a young guy, very charismatic, very much in love with the ladies, very much in debt. And so he needed to find a way to, make money so he could get out of debt. And Crassus sort of became his mentor. And then Caesar just took the ball where he got it. And he ends up becoming consul in 59 BC. That's the significance that Mary's talking about, because it was due to Caesar becoming consul that he could move up the ladder, all right, pay his debts, make a lot of money in Gaul, all right, by taking over a lot of territory, all right, and, eventually become Caesar, meaning, dictator, and eventually get killed because everybody was jealous of his fame and his money. That's how this guy rose to power. He was poor, well, relatively. Okay, he was from a noble family. But Crassus took him under his wing, and then he ran with the ball, and then he ended up beating Pompey. But before that happened, they formed this kind of mild thing they call today, but not at the time, the first triumvirate. Caesar then, gets to have his day in the sun. He becomes consul, and he starts doing stuff with it. And of course, the first triumvirate breaks down because Crassus and Pompey end up getting, in fighting with each other. And then Caesar ends up profiting from their fighting with each other. And he does so by distance from Gaul. Kind of like Winston Churchill wrote all those reports from South Africa. Caesar wrote all these reports from Gaul to make himself popular in the Roman mind. And then, of course, he crosses the Rubicon in order to allegedly deliver Rome from the civil war that they were going to suffer under Pompey and Crassus. That's how he wins. Okay? Meanwhile, in order to do that, he himself forms a second triumvirate with Antony, and I want to say it's Lepidus, but I don't see Lepidus' name mentioned here. Okay? And as a result of all this, Caesar, of course, gets killed in 44 BC. All right? And this thing is all covering that story. All right. As a result of which, his nephew, known to history as Octavianus, later known to history as Augustus, will end up sort of forming a triumvirate of his own with Antony, and I think that's when Lepidus comes in. And maybe there's a second there. I get confused with the names sometimes. Anyway, Antony ends up going again. No, it's Anthony. Oh, I forget the other guy's name. Not Lepidus. Lepidus was the second triumvirate with Caesar. Anthony, I forget who. It might have even been Crassus. Was Crassus still alive then? Anyway, there was another triumvirate that Octavian was part of, ended up becoming part of, and then they all started fighting with each other, and Octavian finally won. All right, and that's what Mary is leading to when she says, and I'll show you in the next increment what she says. That's what Mary's leading to when she says, holy his name, even his own great mercy, from generation to generation, among those revering him. I'm going to have to explain why I translated it that way. But do you see the chronological point? She's accounting this whole switch over to Rome as a deliverance. See, the paragraph starts here. Even though we know that this is part of the middle of a sentence, and even though any Greek scholar can tell you hoti doesn't begin a sentence, all right, it's got its own subunit syntactically within it. Okay? In proper Greek, you'd say epoisen gar. You wouldn't begin it with hoti. Unless you're trying to be really dramatic, and maybe she is. This is not the normal way to begin a Greek sentence. Just like we say you don't begin sentences with but in proper English, proper American English, you do not begin a sentence with the word but. And you try not to begin a sentence with a preposition. And you certainly don't end a sentence with a preposition. In other words, we have rules about word placement and what words should terminate a sentence or begin it. They did too. Generally speaking, hoti doesn't begin a sentence. If you have a word hoti here, you're expecting that some text or idea is in front of it, before the word. The contrast is with the word gar, which is never also at the beginning of a sentence, but it does begin a sentence as a post-positive function. In other words, the proper would be epoisen gar, okay? Or epoisen moi gar. I'm saying it in bad Greek today, okay? So, to see hoti here, you know that the sentence isn't really beginning there. But at the same time, its meaning is one unit here, which of course is easier to see in the English. For the Almighty has accomplished mighty things for me. Then here comes our second chorus. Definitely holy, his name. There's no is in the sentence. It's not holy is his name. It's holy, his name. Even his own great mercy from and to each generation among those revering him. And this, historically in Mary's narrative, is ending at 59 BC, which we just saw, is when Caesar first becomes consul, and he takes advantage of it. He's a young man, he's hungry, he's in debt, and he takes advantage of it in order to gain power over everybody else. All right? And people would know that. In her day, the stories of famous people in particular, their stories, their dates, their everything, just like we obsess over movie stars and when they were born, they obsessed over people too. How old were they? What were the names of their wife and kids? When did they come to power? When did they fall from power? All that stuff was the topic of daily conversation. So she would know this, and of course it was also taught in school. All right? So she's dating this deliverance back to 59, 58 BC, end of 59, beginning of 58, when Caesar was consul, because that's when he started his climb to power. I mean, he had been a praetor, and an aedile, and all these other offices that you had to be first, and he kind of did it fast. All right? I forget if he did it in the right order. Something tells me he did it a little too fast, and he was dogged by that. But I could be confusing him with someone else. The point is, this is when he gets his first consulship, which was the top of the tree as far as the Romans were concerned. Okay? That was, your next step was you're going to be a senator. All right? And sometimes you had to be a senator in order to be a consul. And I don't remember if he was a senator at that point. All right? I don't think he ever was. My brain is out. All right? So, but this is 59, 58 BC. That's where she's stopping it. It was due to Caesar's rise that the republic stopped being a republic. If Caesar didn't rise and cross the Rubicon, the Roman Republic would have limped on the way it was. It was horrible. Everything was disorganized. Even their calendar was awful. They had this goofiest calendar I've ever seen. I mean, even the Egyptians reformed their calendar in 238 BC to do leap year. But it took Rome until 44 BC under Julius Caesar to do the same thing. That was the Canopus decree in Egypt, 238 BC. All right? So she's dating it to the rise of Caesar, and correctly so. God raised Cyrus. God raised the Persian kings. God raised Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great was very pro-Israel. God raised, the competition between the two Greek cities, the two Greek, king of the north, king of the south, in order to keep Israel in the middle. And that hurt her, but that helped her too. And then God raised Rome. And Mary is basically saying all this, dating back from Hanukkah, which is the same date as the laying of the foundation of the second temple, which, finishing of the foundation of the second temple, which is in Haggai 2, which she's going to get ready to quote in her next paragraph. So that ends her first paragraph. She begins it at Hanukkah and the aftermath, with the Diadochi and all that. And she ends it with Rome. And she's doing this for a reason. She's tying back to Daniel. Okay, because Daniel did this review of history. Daniel ended his history with the rise of Greek on time track 1 and the rise of Rome on time track 2, which we're going to see in the next increment. But I still have to finish going through Mary here. So that's her first paragraph, ending with the rise of what's going to end up being a hero of Israel. Because if Rome stayed a republic, she would have never been able to branch out and have enough control in order to protect Israel. Even though the people that she was protecting hated her for protecting them. That's what she did. Because, look, where did we start with this? Israel had become apostate under the Maccabees. John Hyrcanus takes power here, and he usurps the houses of David and Aaron, just as his father Simon had done. So Israel needed a savior from herself. The trouble was the available saviors offered at that time were more against her than being apostate from within, and at least being apostate from within, the temple still stood standing. So the temple still stood standing. Until happinesses, the internal guy, John Hyrcanus, dies right there at that syllable marked in black. Oh yeah, well now Israel's all going to be blessed from now on. Okay. The Almighty is accomplishing great things for her, because from starting here, that's 100 BC at the end, at the 63, that's when Marius changes the Roman military, which allows Julius Caesar to get the kind of conquering victories that he got. See, it was all set up. And as a result of that conquering victory, Rome too was saved from being a republic. She was just a complete washout as a republic. And therefore Julius Caesar came to the throne. They got jealous of him because he had too much. They killed him because he was too smart, too cute, too everything. And his not so cute son, but quite shrewd, Octavian, aka Augustus, ended up taking over and converting Rome to an empire, which ended up saving the Middle East. Because everybody in the Middle East, and this is the point I was getting at, the reason why Rome was a savior is that everybody in the Middle East, especially in Israel, was busily engaged in little petty civil wars with each other, each one trying to take power from the next guy. And that's what our boy Hyrcanus got frustrated when he died. All those factions were there in place, and they were all arguing with each other. They were all arguing with each other. The nicest thing God could do to save Israel from herself was to save Rome by revolutionizing military power so that Rome could take over the Mediterranean world and therefore protect Israel from herself. This is all the backdrop to where Mary is at the time she talks. All that history had to be done in order for her to be able to say what she's saying. So why wouldn't she be saying, the Almighty has accomplished great things for me? Yeah, all of history. Definitely, holy is his name. This could be an antiphonal response. Even his own great mercy, from generation to generation, among those revering him. That ends the paragraph at the advent of Julius Caesar's first consulship. Now, why did I translate it among those revering him? The usual translation will say to those revering him. This in the Greek is what's called a dative case. All right? That's why you see it usually translated to. In English, the dative case is indicated by the preposition to, on behalf of, for whom a thing is done. But in Greek, the dative case, especially in classical Greek, and remember, that's Mary's training, that's why she's eliding syllables. In classical Greek, you didn't used to use prepositions. They were considered inelegant. So what you did instead is you just used case endings. Dative here. This is dative case. Twice. To those. In our English, that's how we translate it. Okay, but this also means among those. Okay? If you had the preposition "en" here, which is a feature of Koine Greek, but in classical Greek you didn't need it, and I'm going to explain why you don't want it here. You would have "en" and you'd have plus "tois." And that would mean among those. Okay? Among and behalf of. And that's why she doesn't have a preposition here. It's on behalf of, that's the pure classical meaning of the dative case. All right, but it's on behalf of and among. See, who's going to be saying this? Those revering him. And where is he going to be in eternity? Because that's what it's talking about. See, from and to each generation, that's a tag back to Psalm 90 verses 1 through 2. Oh God, you've been our dwelling place for every generation. That's what we're going to be saying in the millennium. And you're going to be alive to see it. Well, who's saying it? Where is he when this chorus is talking? Who's there among them? God. What is the main promise in the Old Testament? I will be among you. So she's playing on, yes, we're the beneficiaries. That's the dative case, indirect object. But she's also playing on location. Because why? Because the location of the one who's going to be causing all this action is where? The body parts are developing in her womb as she talks. And what's his name going to be when he's born? Emmanuel, God with us. So I submit to you that the right preposition to use here in English, because we already can see the two up here, that's why I put it there, is among. To play on the dual entendre meaning of the dative case. I'm sorry I had to take that side trip on the techie Greek stuff, but somebody I just know is going to say, how come you translated it with among? There's no Greek preposition there. Yeah, and in classical Greek you didn't use prepositions. You used case endings, and you wanted the case endings to have multiple meanings. That was classical Greek drama. If you were a good speaker or a good writer, you always wanted things to be multiple entendre. And that's what she's doing here. All right, so that's the end of the first paragraph. Now we got to get into the second paragraph because I'm still coming back to why she ties to Daniel. Next time. Okay, so what's the meaning of 48 BC? That's when Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Actually, he did it in 49 BC, but there's a long story. And he wrote about it himself. Okay, on the left-hand side of the screen, about the middle of the screen, you see the title of this book that you're seeing on screen called The Art of Caesar's Bellium Civitae. Sorry, I can't read too well right now. Literature, Ideology, and Community by a guy named Luca Grillo. It's sold by Cambridge University Press, and you can get it at Amazon, and I'm probably going to buy this book for $41. It's half the price as Barnes & Noble, as you'll notice. Okay, what this guy does, and I learned this in Latin class, okay? What this guy does is he goes through Caesar's style of discourse. See, Caesar was sitting in Gaul. He first gets the consulship, all right? That's where we stopped at the last increment. He gets the consulship and he finagles his way into getting governorship of Gaul. It's in Gaul that he made his money to pay off his debts. It's in Gaul that he made his reputation. Meanwhile, he's sort of sitting back away from Rome, which is a time-honored way of getting ready to have power. Okay, I'm not sure how well he planned this in advance, but he wasn't stupid, okay? He knew that his two colleagues, Crassus and Pompey, were going to be at each other's throats, and he wanted to stay away from it. Constantine will end up doing the same thing. Okay, Constantine won. Okay, he's going to end up playing the same game, you know, how do you want to call it, about 300 years later. So Caesar's sitting there in Gaul, you know, winning the hearts of the people of Gaul, winning the hearts of the Romans by writing them dispatches. Okay, so he's playing the provincial hero. He's giving them stuff that the popular mind will like. And what this guy does, this guy Luca Grillo, in this book that you see here on screen, is he's analyzing Caesar's literary style. And if my Latin teacher is still alive watching this video, I will be very happy. Okay? Because this was something my Latin teacher did. And we had to go through, you know, all the writings of Julius Caesar. All right? It was one of the things in Latin that they made us do in the, 3 or 4 years we had it. So that's what this guy is doing. It's going to be really interesting to read his book. What he's saying on the page in front of you is he's trying to explain why Caesar ends book 1 of his Bellum Civitae, sorry. My pronunciation sucks. Why he ends it with a cliffhanger and then starts book 2, okay, like he ends book 1 saying that the war is over, but the war's really not over. So you're frustrated when you read the end of book 1. And then he starts book 2 with the war continuing, because it doesn't really end until when? 48 BC, which is what? The number that Mary's going to use to begin her second paragraph in the Magnificat, starting at verse 51, which we're going to get back to. But I'm just introducing it by showing you this is what the history she's tying to. All right? So Caesar was cultivating human approbation long before he crossed the Rubicon. You got that? And he does it in order to make it easy for him to cross the Rubicon. Sorry, it's there's a storm going on outside. He's making it easy to cross the Rubicon and win popular opinion so that, just like he did in Gaul, he doesn't have to, stab anybody or use his troops. That was his genius. Okay, he was very personable. All right, and he was really smart. I forget who it was it Gibbon or some other Roman historian that made the note that Caesar could be dictating to 7 or more secretaries at once on very different topics, going from one secretary to the next, just keeping like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 topics in his mind at all times. He was a great organizer, all right, and I think he also had epilepsy, so that tells you, not to, have a phony view about epilepsy. Okay, epilepsy and genius kind of go hand in hand, all right, but that's a sidebar. So now in the next increment, I'm going to go back to more about this period in history, which is the crossing of the Rubicon, the campaign of 49 to 48 BC. It really doesn't end until 45, but it started, okay, in 49 BC with all kinds of little stuff going on outside Rome, and then it centers on Rome in 48 BC forward. And we'll cover that in the next increment.